Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, which is co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. I'm Marvin Kalb, Executive Director of the Washington office of the Shorenstein Center. The United States is now engaged in a war against terrorism, a war that President Bush says will be long and hard and costly. Our focus tonight is war correspondence, and our thoughts, our hopes and prayers tonight are with a young Wall Street Journal reporter named Daniel Pearl, who was kidnapped in Pakistan 2 weeks ago. He was doing his job, but the job of the war correspondent has become very dangerous, in a way it always has been from World War II right up to Afghanistan. Media watchdog groups estimate that 30 to 40 reporters were killed doing their jobs all over the world last year. Many correspondents believe naively that bullets are not meant for them. They don't see themselves as antagonists in a war. They see themselves simply as reporters covering a war. Curious, objective, energetic, sometimes patriotic. That depends on the war. Some are professional war correspondents going from one battlefield to another. Most of them cover wars, and then when the war is over, they stay overseas as foreign correspondents, or they go home to cover political campaigns or Capitol Hill or whatever. Tonight we've asked 7 journalists who've covered wars all over the world to share their experiences with us. What did they do? What did they learn? What differences did they see between covering World War II and then covering Afghanistan? I'll introduce them all and then ask each of them to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll talk. First, Richard C. Hotelet, one of Edward R. Murrow's original CBS wonders. Hotelet covered the rise of Nazi power in Germany. He was arrested in 1941 in Berlin, released 4 months later, part of an exchange. In 1944, he did the first eyewitness account of the Allied invasion of Normandy Beach. George Herman, he covered the war in Korea for CBS News, including the dramatic American landing at Incheon, and then from then right to the very end, the peace talks that seemed to go on forever and ever. He then returned to Washington to cover the White House, which is a war of another sort. Liz Trotter, a reporter for more than 40 years, 14 of them with NBC News. Trotter was the first woman in television news to be assigned as a combat correspondent in Vietnam. She also covered the India-Pakistan War, the Yom Kippur War, and the so-called Troubles in Ireland. Morley Safer has been a co-editor of CBS's 60 Minutes for 32 years. That means he can hold a job, among other things. In 1965, his report from Vietnam showing U.S. Marines burning a village, which appeared on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, helped change American public opinion about the war. David Shipler, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, who covered Vietnam, Moscow, and Jerusalem when the Israelis in the early 1980s moved into southern Lebanon, leading to the expulsion of the Palestinians from Lebanon, one of those major turning points in the Middle East struggle, which continues right up to today. Carla Robbins is the chief diplomatic correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where she's worked since 1993. Before that, she was senior diplomatic correspondent and Latin American bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report. Like a lot of other reporters, she covered the Persian Gulf War largely from a base in Saudi Arabia. And finally, Colin Soloway, a contributing editor now at Newsweek, who covered the war in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan since October of last year. Prior to joining Newsweek, he lived in Sarajevo and covered the war in former Yugoslavia for a number of different news organizations. Soloway broke the story about John Walker Lind, the 20-year-old Californian who fought for the Taliban and is now in U.S. custody. Okay, let's start with Hodelit, and then we'll go all the way around, ending with Soloway, each war correspondent telling us what it was like, what he or she learned. 2 minutes, please, Dick Hodelit.
I've got an old wilted restricted order from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force dated the 11th of May, 1944, signed by Dwight Eisenhower, General U.S. Army. The subject is accredited war correspondence, and it's addressed to all unit commanders of the Allied Expeditionary Force, and something that could be required reading in some places in Washington today. He first says that all war correspondents, he considers all war correspondents quasi-staff officers, which nowadays we'd call virtual staff officers, which didn't mean a lot, but it was a bit of dignity. And he goes on. As a matter of policy, accredited war correspondents should be accorded the greatest possible latitude in the gathering of legitimate news. Consequently, it is desired that, subject always to the requirements of operations, of which the commander of these on the spot must be the sole judge, commanders of all echelons and public relations officers and conducting officers give accredited war correspondents all reasonable assistance. They should be allowed to talk freely with officers and enlisted personnel and to see the machinery of war in operation in order to visualize and transmit to the public the conditions under which the men from their countries are waging war against the enemy. No hokum, a straight professional description, and one which fitted our circumstances. We were assigned to the Army, attached to the Army, subject to censorship, which occasionally was pretty stupid. The relationship was not all that cozy, as all military organizations and headquarters have their own labels, their own codes. The code description of the 1st Army Press Corps, press headquarters, was muckraker. And it was, I think, only half with a smile. The notion of where we belonged and what we were doing, we were attached but independent. And we could go anywhere we wanted to go. We could speak to anyone who was willing to speak to us. We went into headquarters. We went in operations. I mean, the Battle of the Bulge was one that I remember with particular vividness. We were there and we could talk. The only limit to what we could say was the limit of the antediluvian technology that saddled us. I would turn up, be ordered on the air, given time on our World News Roundup or our evening news, and turn up day after day and not be able to get through because the circuit from we were with 1st Army headquarters in a place called Spa in Belgium, could not reach the United States. I was able at one point to get through with the opening of the Battle of the Bulge, not ever to the United States, but because we were able to call London, and the BBC, with which we had very good relations, was able to pass it on to the United States.
And Dick, you wore a uniform, did you not?
We wore a uniform. Yes, well, I wore a uniform in Vietnam too, but in Vietnam I bought it at the black marketeers on Tuzo Street. It wasn't a war. We weren't war correspondents. So a non-war correspondent like Morley Saver will testify to that.
Okay. George Herman.
We were official war correspondents. We wore a uniform with a UN war correspondent's patch on one shoulder. We were put up in military billets, which were frequently cold as hell. We were fed at the Army's mess tables. We carried ID cards giving us military rank. I was major through colonel, which meant that if I were captured, I would be put in a field officer's POW camp, not an enlisted man's POW camp. I was grateful for the designation. At the Inchon invasion, we were told ahead of time when it would happen. We were assigned to our ships. Not one word leaked out. We and the Army were in each other's pockets. We believed in each other. I did, however, sneak out a word to Douglas Edwards in the CBS television news that maybe it would be a good idea if they built their map up and to the left, which would include Inchon. We broadcast or teletyped our copy, depending on which medium we worked for, free from any censorship whatsoever, none, for the first 6 months, a fact that made me damn nervous. I was worried that I might give away something that might injure or kill some American troops. After General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident, MacArthur imposed censorship largely because he wanted to forbid the use of retreat about any of his troops.
Go back to Vietnam and Liz Trotter.
Vietnam was the beginning and the end of, I guess, what was a healthy press relationship with the military up till then. I remember a lot of young reporters, and myself included, we all had visions of that man out in the front there, pictures of Ernie Pyle, the great Ernie Pyle, the GI's friend, the man who could let everybody back home know what it was like to smell and to feel and to hear the war, to have the war right in your face. And I think that's what we generally tried to do as correspondents in Vietnam, because we had such unlimited access. There were very few things that we couldn't do. We couldn't go out on operations that you're seeing now in Vietnam, special forces operations, long-range reconnaissance patrols. Pardon me?
What we're now seeing in Afghanistan?
Yes, special forces operations, special ops operations, small platoons of, that's redundant, but platoons of Americans doing cross-border operations, going into North Vietnam, going into Cambodia, going into Laos. So those were pretty much off limits unless you got lucky, and some it did every now and then.
Thank you, Liz. Morley Safer.
Just as Liz said, the access was extraordinary, and the only limitation were these cross-border operations, but you could even go on those. The great rift with the military spokesman, really grew out of any rationale for the war. I think reporters will buy anything and go along with anything if there is not even a good explanation, an implicit explanation, like Afghanistan, certainly World War II, and Korea as well. And here you had this rather vague, unarticulatable reason for going to war. You also had what was largely a citizen army. These were draftees in Vietnam, unlike Afghanistan. There were draftees in the 60s when questions were being asked about everything. So morale was terrible because nobody could give these guys any reason for them. I mean, it was like the old World War II song, we're here because we're here. There was no other reason for being there. The military establishment in Saigon and Da Nang, which were the two main headquarters, essentially grew to really hate us. And the reason they hate us, and they articulated it many times, was that the press would not get on the team. Those are the words they used. Meantime, the press was saying, well, we can't get on the team because we don't know what game they're playing.
From Vietnam to the Middle East, David Shipler, and I'm going to appeal to you again. Try to keep it to 2 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion. And
I guess of the wars that are supposed to be discussed, mine is the only one that doesn't involve the United States. I covered the 1982 war in Lebanon, where Israel invaded, and I covered it from Jerusalem. I was based in Jerusalem. And it's probably worth looking at the question of access, because I think this is a subject that's going to be recurring this evening. The Israelis would not let any of us into southern Lebanon during the fighting. They kept us out for several days until the major fighting was over and the Israelis had gone all the way to the outskirts of Beirut. They also had censorship. That is, what we wrote had to be put through the censor. But in fact, the censor was not very heavy-handed. The real problem came at the source, that is, in the limitation to our access. Meanwhile, of course, correspondents in Beirut were covering the war as well. So the result of this was that the Israeli perspective and rationale really never got worked into the main war story during the fighting. It was always a sidebar at the margins. And I think that made for some serious public relations problems for Israel down the road a piece. And one of the things that I remember happening is inflated casualty figures, civilian casualty figures, being promoted first by the Palestinian National Red Crescent Society. The numbers were then picked up by the International Committee for the Red Cross in Beirut and circulated. The figures were wildly exaggerated, the figures of homeless, of numbers killed, wounded, and it was obvious as soon as we got into the area that these numbers were extremely high and not realistic. But by then, they had been kind of imprinted in the minds of the public around the world as horrendous casualties caused by the Israelis. And this could have been avoided, actually, if the Israelis had allowed correspondents in at the time, because those inflated figures would never have had legs, would never, I think, have been accepted by the ICRC, in fact, had there been free and open reporting from the field at the time.
Still in the Middle East, thank you, David. But in the Gulf War, Carla Robbins, what was it like?
Well, when they say that war is hell, I mean, this was certainly my purgatory. First of all, Saudi Arabia itself was an extraordinary place to work. I always said that I was the trifecta of things you didn't want to be in Saudi Arabia. I was a woman, a reporter, and a Jew. This, by definition, meant that I had 3 strikes against me. For women, we couldn't drive anywhere by ourselves. We could barely go outside by ourselves. And the U.S. military was always posing themselves as the great ones who were going to defend us. They were going to tell the Saudis that they needed to have American reporters there because there were 500,000 American troops there, and they had the responsibility of getting the word home about what their life was going to be like there and what the reason they were there in the first place. But the reality was that the military also never let us out of their sight, and they barely let us out of the hotel. And I was unfortunately one of the pool organizers, for which I think I now should have my head shaved for collaborating with the enemy. And the reason I did this is because I worked for the Third News magazine at that point, and I was terrified the time in news we were going to elbow us out of the way, so I became the pool coordinator for precisely that reason. It is true that I blame all you Vietnam reporters, that we were paying the price, although I also celebrate you because I became a foreign correspondent because of the extraordinary work that you guys did. The military was still fighting that war with us, and they never forgave the press for Vietnam. And no matter how many times you told them that, we are you and we are the American public and this is democracy and we didn't lose the war, they never believed us. And the goal was, and this was just an absolute control freak exercise on the part of it, the goal was, and Defense Secretary, now Vice President Cheney, was very clear about this afterwards, that the intention was to never let the press get close to the war. And that's what the pool system did.
Soloway, you were in Afghanistan. So
Boy,
what's up?
I really feel like I'm almost at the nadir of the press-military relationship. Absolutely, I think one of the most frightening things to me as a journalist and as an American is that the public actually support the Pentagon policy of we used to call it, I think, probably in Vietnam they called it this too, the sort of mushroom policy, press policy, sort of keep the hacks in the dark and feed them. I found again I was not dealing with many public affairs officers in Afghanistan. For the most part, in fact, it was very difficult to find a U.S. military guy who was willing to acknowledge to you that he was anything other than, I don't know, a tourist or just a soldier who couldn't talk to you at all. But in terms of moving around in Afghanistan as a journalist, when we weren't dealing with the U.S. military, for the most part, we could pretty much go where we wanted. Obviously, there was the danger that you might run into some Taliban who had a price on your head. but sometimes the reception you got from them was almost more friendly than from the military. You know, it is a very difficult war to cover. It's more difficult, from the standpoint of covering U.S. operations, it was more difficult, especially in the early stages, than probably any other, in the sense that all these were special operations. I mean, that you were out, you'd be out somewhere or in town, and you would run into these guys, and they were under orders not to talk to you. Often you would talk to them or try and talk to them lots of times, and they would say, look, we're really sorry, but you know, we can't talk to you. You know, I like Newsweek. I used to subscribe. You know, I'd say, do you want a new subscription? We can send it here. But look, we can't talk to you. What I found most disturbing about this was both that I think Americans have a rather distorted view of how the war was run. I don't think it's unrealistic to say that most of the guys out there were doing a great job. We're doing their job very well and very professionally. That being said, you know, when we actually look at most of the stories about what happened in this war, the vast majority of the stories, and even the most exciting stories, were actually reported out of Washington. You know, a couple of weeks ago, there was a story about these raids near Kandahar, and I was reading it saying, wow, this is amazing. You know, these guys raided this compound, and they shot all these guys, and they captured these guys. And then I realized it was Dateline out of Washington, and then I realized it was also, you know, in the Washington, it was New York Times and in the Washington Post, the same story. You know, sometimes you wonder, well, what the hell are we doing here in Afghanistan if they're getting the good story? You know, if all the reporting is actually coming out of Washington, and no one is really raising hell about it back in Washington and New York about actually getting us access. We can talk about that later.
Okay, but let me raise a discourteous question to all of you. Who do you guys think you are? I mean, seriously, if the American people, it's a democracy, and the American people voted this administration into office, they're conducting the war the way they choose, the American people are content with it, so far as all of the polls are concerned that I've seen, why do you think you deserve some kind of better treatment?
Because
I don't think so at all.
Puts us in that position.
Because the First Amendment.
The First Amendment puts us in the position.
But I don't agree with that. I think we're getting what we're now getting what we sowed many, many years ago, and that was in Vietnam. The country was ahead of us. The country's ahead of us now. They are not as liberal as the press is. And it's, you know, when young men were coming home and arriving in the airports and getting spit at, and they'd have to run into the ladies' and men's rooms to change their uniforms so they wouldn't have anything to do with Vietnam, when the ministers were denouncing them in small towns in Maine from pulpits because they'd been in Vietnam, how do you expect the military culture and the people, so many in this country who support it, to feel? So I think we had it coming.
I mean, I think that, I mean, there's a fundamental thing. During the Gulf War, the justification always was, you don't want to get Americans killed. You don't want to get American troops killed. You don't want to call in flight, you know,
That's a very compelling
bombing
argument.
on your own unit and all of that. And I find that very compelling. And I think that we as reporters have a responsibility to send the best people there, the smartest people there, the best prepared people there. You don't just send, you know, the last person who comes in who's got a really cute pair of glasses down. But nevertheless, I think that if you, and I've got really cute glasses, I think that...
Does that describe us?
Yes. But I think at the same time, if you really talk to the people in the military, their problem wasn't their fear that we were going to destroy operational security. They were still smarting over Vietnam, that somehow we had lost the war. And as pompous as it may seem, I happen to agree that we have a responsibility, not only a right under the First Amendment, but a responsibility under the First Amendment to the American people. It's what makes this place such a great country, is that when things go wrong, at least the American public begins to understand why they're going wrong. And yes, the public may say right now...
If you read the debates over the First Amendment, or what became the First Amendment, by the Founding Fathers, there was only one reason for it, and that was so that the press could help the people find out when their rulers went astray.
After Vietnam, they wised up. Up to Vietnam, there was a general idea, and I think you guys might confirm it, that not only do the military have a responsibility to brief the press very closely, and also there was this genuine trust between the two.
Yes.
Very powerful trust. After Vietnam, I think they sat down and they said, there is nothing good the press can do for us.
Because I got to Vietnam after the American troops had left. So the Vietnam that I covered from 73 to 75 was a war being fought by the Vietnamese, which made it very different. You could see quickly how parochial we all are in concentrating on what Americans are doing and what Americans were risking, because fortunately for me, editors had stopped wanting combat coverage when I got there, because the war was still going on, but Americans weren't fighting it anymore. So we had the opportunity of writing about the impact of the war rather than the war itself. Not rather than, but in addition to the war itself, we could write about the impact on that society, which was immense, deep, and still lasts. So I think that that kind of coverage is something that, if you want to call the war correspondent, any correspondent, has to do all the time in whatever war you're involved in, and particularly when you're on, when you're not covering a war that has a huge military apparatus, but one that interacts with the civilian population a great deal. So, for example, in the Middle East, there's a war going on. It's a twilight war between the Israelis and the Palestinians now. But that war is a very important war to cover in terms of the impact on those two societies. I was there for 3 weeks last spring revising a book I did some years ago and working on a film for PBS, and it was very dangerous to spend time on the West Bank, and I did, but it was risky. People use tape or paint to put TV on the side of their cars, on the trunks, on the hood. You go with a Palestinian and be sure that it's somebody who knows what he's doing, or you get in a Palestinian taxi who can take you way back on the back roads through Arab villages where you're not near any Jewish settlements, because those are the areas where the clashes can take place. It's now the Israelis have refused to renew press credentials for a large number of Palestinian journalists, many of whom help American news organizations do exactly this. The result, inevitably, it seems to me, will be less coverage, less good coverage from the West Bank and Gaza. We are going to know less about what the Palestinians are thinking, what the Israeli army is actually doing there. I think all of this kind of thing operates to distort the reality and not enhance it. I actually, as a consumer of news from Vietnam, because as I say, the American troops were gone by the time I got there, I have to say that I felt pretty well served by the press as a citizen in Vietnam. I absolutely, completely reject any idea that the press was responsible for the outcome of that war. It's absolutely absurd.
Hadalit, I wanted to ask you this, and then I'd like to have a couple of you jump in on this point. Does it make any difference to you as a war correspondent when you're out there in an environment of danger, high challenge, that the American people are supporting the aims of the war? In other words, does it make any difference whether the war you're covering is one supported by the American people or questioned by the American people?
No, our function is, whether we're war correspondents or peace correspondents or political correspondents, is to tell what we think is going on, what we try to find out, and without any bias, without any obligation to any side. The war was a phenomenon. It was a performance. It was a series of events, and they were reported on their own strength. It had nothing to do with whether we thought we were right or our cause was just. Now, I mean, we thought, of course, that our cause was just, but it didn't matter. When things went sour, we reported that we were defeated. That the Battle of the Bulge was a setback for the United States. There was never any suggestion by people. I was up with the First Division all the time. There was never any suggestion of concealing what was going on. We were fighting with our backs to the wall. Fortunately, I mean, everything worked out well, but it was the event, the objective event that we were trying to understand and convey, and that is, after all, the rock bottom of everything we do as members of the press.
First of all, there are two kinds of war reporting. There was the Ernie Pyle. I was with the troops, and this is what they got to eat, and they couldn't sleep because of this, that, and the other. If Dick Hotlet, when I was the editor in New York, if Dick Hotlet had come up with a story a la Ernie Pyle about how the troops were suffering, I'd have said, don't you have any news? I wanted how the war was going. When I was reporting from Korea, if I came up with a story about how the troops were doing this or that, the guy in New York would say, but how is the war going? That's what he wanted. And he wanted it in Hotlet's day in 3 minutes, then cut down to 2 minutes. And in my case, they wanted it in 1 minute. And sometimes they'd say, can you cut 15 seconds out of that? So there were two kinds of reporting that were available to us, but our masters, the people who put us on the air, in those days, there was no 60 Minutes. In those days, they only wanted the strategy. They didn't care to hear from us about the sufferings of the troops.
I want to raise an issue. Hang on a sec.
No,
Woolley,
just to answer your
Woolley,
question.
please.
The question you put to Richard, that
To talk to an anchorman,
you're neither the emissaries of the military or the policy or of, indeed, public sentiment back home. I mean, you really...
You're your own man.
You really are your own people.
Except in Liz's
in those cases. And one terrific example of not being anyone's emissary is Somalia. Think about Somalia for a moment, of how we got in. I mean, it's so current now with this
Pictures got us in and pictures got us out.
May I make a point?
You can make, Liz, but I'm desperate. I have got to get this issue in.
I've been better than anybody now.
You've been fantastic. Go ahead. Go ahead. What the heck? I was going to ask you, can I ask you a question?
Oh, please.
Okay. You know about John Lawrence's new book?
I haven't read it. I've seen it.
The Cat from Hue, A Vietnam War Story. A week or so ago, John Lawrence was being interviewed by Brian Lamb of PBS, discussing his book. And Lawrence said the following: I felt a kind of moral obligation based on what I had learned to do whatever I could to help to try to stop the war. And the only way that I could do that was as a correspondent for CBS. And Lamb then noted that Lawrence wrote in his book on page 531, trying to stop the war was a burning issue with me. And then he said to Lamb, the only way he could do that was as a correspondent for CBS.
Are you surprised by that? I think everybody at CBS knew he was an advocate. Everybody outside CBS knew he was an advocate.
No, but the answer to your question is yes. I was
not surprised at all. It was quite obvious.
What does that mean to you, and what does it mean about the nature? I get back to that same question I asked Dick before. If you're covering a war like Vietnam, do you think to yourself that you're going to present a story in a way that kind of fits in with what you take to be the public's attitude toward the war? You playing to that? Morley, did you find that to be the case, Liz?
I found that to be the case. In some cases, yes.
I confess I didn't, partly because I'm a Canadian. So I didn't feel,
right.
You can feel as engaged. The last thing in the world you want to see are these terrific young men killed. Obviously, you feel a responsibility, a human attachment. But I think I had the advantage of having that half step back from it.
Canadian nationality.
Yeah.
It's complicated because, being a correspondent in the field is a kind of trial and error process. You, in my case, write a story and it either gets used or doesn't. It gets used prominently or not. And you get reinforced on the stories you write that get used. And therefore you learn something about, it's about what works. And I don't think editors or reporters are immune from the vicissitudes of American society. We're all part of the society. This notion that the press somehow is in its own orbit, completely separate from the will of the public, I think is not the case. I think there's a very interesting symbiosis between the press and the public. And I'm not sure the press is always leading public tastes. I think often we're following and we're adapting unconsciously. We're not perhaps introspective enough or self-critical enough to be setting an agenda that might be better than the one that seems to be working with the public. So I think it's very complex.
Does the Lawrence comment shock you,
Yeah,
surprise you?
it really, I don't know him, but I mean, I met him once, but
does?
it shocks me. And
It's
He was always an advocate.
But it's completely,
He was always an advocate.
But it's completely wrong. It's just as wrong to be advocating that a war end, saying that this war is wrong, as it would be to be a cheerleader for the Americans. I don't think that a correspondent, even an American correspondent, should be cheerleading for the Americans. I agree with what Richard said completely. Our job is to find out what's going on. I mean, readers didn't pick up the New York Times to find out what I thought about it. They picked it up to read what was going on. And so that was the objective, to try to find that out.
I do want to make this point. It probably, as being back in the newspaper business now, I can say this more easily, but I do want to make the point that, you know, in the era of Mr. Hotlet and Mr. Herman, the reporter in television, and maybe even in the eyes of the public, was really not important at all. But what we really developed is, I mean, we all knew one another in the business, but the idea of the reporter as egomaniac hadn't evolved yet. It started in Vietnam, from what I can see, when you had, you know, guys getting, you know, flesh wounds and doing their closers in 5 takes, this kind of thing, and people fomenting incidents, and so that it was what I used to call the watch me type school of journalism. You know, here I am, you know, battle weary, you know, passing.
Well, I beg to disagree in part.
But now look at the Gulf and the, you know, the Scud Stud and
Afghanistan's much worse.
And it's in Afghanistan. Yes, tell us about that.
Tell us about
Oh God, I mean, I've never seen such a proliferation of amateurs who literally were going out there. I mean, obviously we make decisions about where we go to some extent because it's good for our careers. It's great, you know, I'll do this. It's a chance to get in the paper. It's a big story. But where people, particularly television, I mean, really, let's be honest, television people, who went out there simply because, not because they were interested, not because they wanted to know anything, I'm not even sure whether they wanted to tell anybody anything, but because they wanted to get on camera. Because in television now, it's all about FaceTime. And being actually, you know, how much are you on TV and are you seen? I mean, you know, even with Newsweek, it's about FaceTime. I mean, with the amount that I've been on TV, they go crazy. And
you mean liking it, that you are?
Newsweek loves it because they think it sells more magazines. But what I meant was, you have people out there who have no experience really as foreign correspondents, not really a whole lot of interest in actually finding out what's going on or telling their audience, their now global audience, actually what is actually happening, and much more interested in putting themselves in situations where the story is about them, where they look dramatic. I think, you know, Geraldo is a perfect example. But, you know...
Did you ever see him...
I did not. Did
you ever see him do a piece that was not accurate?
Well, there was a piece that he did which he got caught on,
right,
where basically he was sort of, again, I did not see it, but as described to me by a reliable source, the, again, where it turns out that he was actually taking footage from other places and putting it in. And again, where it becomes personality driven. It's sort of our guy in the field, this kind of stuff. And you realize, and you see, and again, also as a reporter, you see other reporters working, and obviously you can see some guys know what they're doing, some guys are professional.
Whether these guys are any good or not, they didn't send themselves there.
Exactly.
These are stunts
Exactly.
being pulled by
and again, it's a small minority.
2 or 3 corporations who control all the news we get, certainly all the news we get on television. And you know, this isn't some even amateur editor making a decision. These are calculated corporate decisions, even boardroom decisions in some cases, I suspect.
And in these circumstances, you can't blame the military for actually thinking these people are actually dangerous.
Well, we play into their hands.
There's a major structural difference.
Good.
When Dick Hotlet was the correspondent with in Germany at that time, if he found out something, he would call in sometimes to me on the morning circuit and say, I'm going to such and such a place because I think there's going to be a big story there. He was, and they were, the princes of the business. And everybody in America, the correspondent, I'm talking structure inside CBS, right, and everybody in the country that I ever talked to said they knew who was the correspondent in Germany, they knew who was the correspondent in London, they knew David Schoenbrunn was in, so they were princes in a way, and they were very highly regarded. Now, We have a few correspondents, and we have an enormous superstructure in New York, and they would say to a hotlet, we read in the New York Times that something is about to brew here, go there. And the correspondent would go there. It's a totally different structure.
One of the, just going right off that, George, one of the big issues that we've been discussing here in this series on the Kalb Report this year has been the economic impact, the impact of economics on the newsroom. And Morley was just giving us an illustration of something rather large.
And I have one that's rather large also.
Go ahead.
Carla.
Well, the point is...
George, let me please continue.
I was just going to illustrate your point, but go ahead.
You want to illustrate my point? You can do better than I do.
When we closed a lot of bureaus, we got rid of a lot of camera crews. When there is now, let us say, a riot in Rome, a correspondent from London flies to Rome, and we buy pictures from a Roman television camera crew. And if you think they're going to sell us a picture that doesn't make the government of Italy look good, you don't understand the business. So we are not showing what I would consider neutral, unbiased, good news film or news tape.
Carla, is this
and that's
a problem?
for money. It's a question of money.
Understood. Is this a problem in your experience basically with television news, or do you find it to be the case in print journalism as well? Where is the editor, the editorial filter that would take copy from the war front and say, probably true, but let me double check with the reporter and go back? Where is the editor these days?
Well, since I am an editor these days, I think there's an enormous difference between print and TV these days. Certainly when you all started out, I don't think there was that much difference between us at all. From the point of view of the economics of it, I mean, we have a lot of reporters out there. We are a global newspaper, and I did a lot of the write-throughs of stories during Afghanistan because there's a time difference and because there's a lot of reporters filing from a lot of different places. But at the end of the day, I was a foreign correspondent. I made my career as a foreign correspondent. I'm not going to sit in Washington and decide what's going on the ground in Afghanistan without calling my reporter in Afghanistan. And any editor who doesn't do that doesn't deserve to be a journalist in the first place. This is a fun job.
Colin, do you think, from your experience, that there is going to be enough money provided by the Home Office to continue to cover the war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Iraq, Iran, the axis of evil, all of it? Is there going to be, in your experience?
I mean, again, I've only been with Newsweek a brief period, but in my experience with Newsweek, I've never heard Newsweek question, do I do this? Do I go here? Do I do that on the basis of money? I've never heard them say no. But again, Newsweek is also one of the biggest news organizations, print news organizations in the country, so, and Newsweek has a lot of money. I think for other organizations, I think that, I think you see what we're already seeing, which is that regional American newspapers have a very hard time of fielding, lots of bureaus, lots of people out in the field. And I think where, in some ways, what we'll see and what will, in some ways, may be more dangerous is that as TV starts to run out of money, because it's costing TV networks huge amounts of money, sometimes $1 million a day. I was hearing this sort of stuff, and frankly,
those at the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning of the war and getting to Afghanistan, getting set up and doing this stuff in the feed times. And so, what you will see, and believe me, in print, it's still, in many places, it has an impact. If CNN isn't there, if the nets aren't there, then editors aren't quite so interested. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening in Afghanistan right now. The base in Kandahar gets probed on a regular basis. There's fighting going on. There's all kinds of stuff happening. There's still, fighting going on all over the southern Afghanistan. And we don't see it on TV. We don't see it really very much of anywhere. Why?
So
because TV doesn't have enough money. And if TV isn't covering the stuff, there's less impetus for some print organizations.
There's too much news, you see. I think in terms of broadcast, there is too much, or too much that is described as news and is nothing. And the one single event, I think, that did us in, I'm talking about covering foreign news for television, that did us in was our own technology. When the military made a wonderful discovery with General Schwarzkopf, in those briefings, Schwarzkopf, with the assistance of CNN, essentially said, we don't need you guys. I'm going to report to the American people. And CNN and the rest stood idly by and became like the audience at a late night television talk show. Like Jay Leno's audience was the press. And I don't think this was planned, but it was the combination of the technology, this great character made for television, who was able to, who was able to look beyond the audience and into the living room of every home in America. And that's when the military said, screw it.
I like this guy more than Morley Safer.
And Liz, you can go right now to Secretary Rumsfeld, could you not?
Well,
Pick up
but on
same
that
thing.
point, just to underscore it too, I mean, it's amazing because you think of the wars that have gone before. We had, I'd like to think, lots of content and no technology. I mean, you couldn't get a phone call out of Saigon unless it was booked months ago. A phone call. I mean, there was a telex, but there was no technology. There was no such thing as a cell phone. And now we have all the bells and whistles, but the content's gone. And it shouldn't work in reverse like that, should it?
The day we were able to broadcast live from South Africa was the day we closed the Bureau. I swear to you.
I'd say one kind word for the military in this connection. I listened to the Schwarzkopf briefings, and some of the questions that my colleagues in the press asked him were so humiliating and embarrassing. They asked him questions like, when are you going to launch the attack? And what units will be in? Now, for God's
Night
sake,
Live routine. That was
I thought it really embarrassed me and shamed me for our craft.
But you get them mixed up sometimes, you know, the Saturday Night Live.
They
and
were
the real
young,
thing.
inexperienced people.
The entertainment culture is...
Richard, as you listen to all of this, what are the thoughts of wisdom that run through your mind?
Well, look, technology has overtaken us. There are so many outlets now. There's such a demand for pap to fill them. When we were working, we were a handful of people. The people of the United States wanted to know, for their own sake, for the sake of their family, the sake of their future, what it was that was going on. They were grateful for, I mean, not that we were that good, but they were grateful for getting what seemed to be reliable information as to what was happening. Now, the drizzle, the drenching rain of factoids threatens to drown us. Anybody with a cell phone can call from anywhere, and what are his credentials? What is he talking about? So we've just lost track, and I think Morley and George have put the finger on. It's become a business, and the people who run the corporations, who run the news organizations now, are interested in making money. This is not in itself immoral. The press, to be independent of the government, has to earn its own living, but making money and reaching for the lowest common denominator to get the widest possible audience just diminishes the value of what is said. And anyone can get on with any kind of stupid opinion. We see it day and night on a dozen channels. This technology has just overcome us. And
Richard, didn't Bill Paley in those days want to make a big profit too?
Surely.
So what is the essential?
But he made a famous remark. Murrow said to him at one point, if we do this, it will be terribly expensive. And Paley is quoted as answering him saying, you spend the money, I hired Jack Benny to make the profits.
That's right. That's right. He did say that, but I'm wondering what then becomes the essential difference? If the quest for profit be the same, then is the difference that we find now, the fundamental difference that has changed the nature of war reporting, is it technology? Is it fundamentally technology?
It is fundamentally technology, but it's aided and abetted by a change in what the public needs to be informed. War and peace and scandal and Enron and all the rest of it has become a spectator sport. People do not demand that they be told when something has gone askew, when something does not sort of fit a pattern that should have been formed. They don't say, why didn't you tell us about this? Enron was not exposed by the American press. The big savings and loan scandal of 10, 12 years ago was not exposed by the American press. The Iran-Contra scandal was not exposed by the American press. The American press has become flabby because the American public doesn't demand to know. And why it is, the American public is too busy with other things, too busy with its own life, too busy with its own bottom line.
Soloway, how does this kind of criticism fit in with your relatively new exposure to this industry?
Well, I mean, my exposure to the industry goes back, I guess, about 10 years. But
relative.
Well, yeah, it's true. Given the company here, yeah, absolutely. You know, no, I agree. I mean, I've had and again, also being foreign and also being a freelancer most of my career. Again, you're pretty much the bottom. You're the bottom of the totem pole in terms of stories, and so so I mean, I've had times where coming back, rushing through bandit-infested places to get to a story and sort of have the story, and they say, well, sorry, Joey Buttafuoco is getting out of jail today. Can it hold for tomorrow? And I agree that even in let's say the news magazine business, that Richard is right. To a certain degree, there is, as in television and broadcast, there is this profit motive there. I mean, I remember on September 11th, sending an email to a friend of mine at a news magazine, after being sure that he and his family were okay and that everybody was all right. I said, gee, guess you'll have to kill that Planet of the Apes cover, this week, because that's the sort of stuff that was running, because that was what a lot of editors seemed to think that American people wanted to see. Well, now, thank God for foreign correspondents, at least, that actually there is something abroad that people want to know about, and that people actually see that what happens in the rest of the world is important. And some of us have been spending years and years and years writing about it. But our bosses, in many cases, the big bosses didn't see this as being profitable or exciting for Americans, and it is for now.
David, do war correspondents or correspondents who spend a lot of time covering a war or being overseas, trying to explain the world to the American people, do they have a special responsibility? Are they carrying it out well?
Oh, those are two different questions.
Yes, they are.
Yes, they have a special responsibility. The test of any society is how self-correcting it is. And this society is pretty self-correcting, but the measure of that is how well informed it is. You can never solve a problem without turning it out into the sunlight. You may not solve it then, but you certainly won't if you don't turn it out. I mean, I lived for 4 years in a country whose press was devoted to being a cheerleader and delivering good news, the Soviet Union. Did it solve its problems because it didn't report on them? Well, we saw the answer to that question vividly. So I think that not only foreign correspondents, but domestic reporters have a very heavy obligation, and so do editors, to believe the best about the American public and not settle for the stereotype that the American public doesn't want to know, isn't demanding enough, everything has to be dumbed down to be sold. I actually have a feeling that people in this country are smarter and more interested in the world around them than they're given credit for being by a lot of the people who run the news organizations.
Could I just make it an example for that? In the sense that our job is to actually provide information for our audience, for our readers, so that they, as citizens in a democracy, can make educated decisions, and also so that the systems of government can work better. For example, in Afghanistan, when I went up to Tora Bora, Afghan commanders, Northern Alliance commanders, our allies there, told me that more of their men had been killed by U.S. airstrikes than had been killed by Al-Qaeda. Again, I saw on a number of occasions, very suspicious circumstances where you had American airstrikes on Northern Alliance soldiers.
How could you check that?
Exactly, this is the problem. But what I'm saying is that these are stories which are actually important. They're important not just to the fact that, well, maybe we're bombing our freedom-loving allies by mistakes. Mistakes happen. World War II, it happened all the time. But the question is if we have this problem that we're doing close air support with B-52s, maybe we should actually look at this problem so that in the future it's not U.S. straight-leg infantry that's getting bombed as opposed to Afghans. That's just one example. There's the example of also a number of cases where Afghans have been conning U.S. troops into calling in airstrikes on other Northern Alliance troops, this sort of thing. And again, it's starting to get reported, but these also raise questions about the sort of intelligence and the way that we actually deploy Special Forces troops. There was a great love letter to SOCOM in the New York Times and Washington Post a couple weeks ago about this, about the great job they were doing. Well, this is a problem, and if they don't look at that problem in the future, then it could be Americans getting killed and not just Afghans. And so this is what I mean, and this is why this sort of reporting is important.
But central to all this, and I suppose I should be careful.
You will. I want you to say what I just want to say.
You'll hold that moment.
No, I just want to say that we're coming to that time when those of you who have questions of the panel, there are microphones set up. Please go there, and then I'll get to you. But meantime, line yourselves up. Morley Safer.
Just picking up on the point that Richard was making, there was a time when there were 3 networks, when it was very, very important for those 3 networks, and essentially there were really only 2. ABC was barely
A stepchild.
It was very, very important for those networks to make brownie points with the FCC. And the way you made brownie points, or it was perceived that way, was to put documentaries on, to do broadcasts like Harvest of Shame, and many, many other broadcasts that many of us who worked for CBS were engaged in. At some point, and I don't remember exactly when, probably about 1968 or something, to some extent because of the war and the coverage of the war. And Frank Stanton said to me, look, there are no more brownie points to be made. You guys better remember, we're putting you on now as an indulgence. We are not making points anywhere. Now you have these 3 networks into 300 or whatever they are. And they're also in the MTV business, and they're in the movie business, and they're in the Disney, the Mickey Mouse business, and every business that the billboard business and all of this. We occupy a tiny, tiny little space in the corporate scheme of things, and we don't give them respectability. I mean, we do, but they don't want respectability.
Our time is up for this particular report, but I didn't want to close without once again expressing a prayer and a hope that Daniel Pearl of the Wall Street Journal is found safe. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the 3 of them, the National Press Club, the George Washington University, and the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. I also want to thank C-SPAN, which is run by that wonderful man, Brian Lamb, for being here and disseminating this program on War Correspondents. I want to thank our really splendid panel, and I want to thank all of you for being with us tonight. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck.